Morning, brothers and sisters. I am very pleased to be able to present this week, and I appreciate being invited here back to the Great Lakes Bible School. I'm hoping that the message that we're going to go through when we talk about Peter as being the bridge builder might be helpful to us on a number of levels. There's obvious ones that we're going to see, but whether the bridge building is for the overall community or whether it is for individuals that we're having difficulty with, within our marriages, you name it. That's what we're going to be really focusing on here this week. So in the 5 classes, we're going to be looking at the following. The first one being about bridge building during the first century. And we're going to it's kind of more of an overview here to look at how Peter and his method of dealing with brothers and sisters that were very different and yet finding a way to have that ongoing connective tissue together. We're going to look at that with Peter. And then the next week tomorrow, we'll be looking at how to build bridges and how it's important to have a future focus. I've come to believe this is one of the most important things that we must have as brothers and sisters, is to be able to look at things today and to see things in front of us, but also to have, as it says, not to drive looking at the hood ornament, and you have to be a certain age to know what a hood ornament is, but to be able to look into the distance and see where it is that we're headed. And so we'll look at that. The next one is a very interesting one that Peter introduces in his letter, which is the idea of connecting communities through submission. How submission to one another is critical if we want to build bridges. The 4th class is going to deal with how the pursuit of holiness, finding God's will and pursuing the behaviors that he demands of us for holiness is critical to building bridges. And then finally, if you get a built bridge, you have to maintain it. And we're going to be looking at the feeding of the flock, which is what he deals with in chapter 5 of 1 Peter, and how that allows us to maintain strong bridges for the long distance. So we're going to be talking about bridges. I've asked my brother-in-law, Jerry, who knows more about bridges and more about trains especially, to remain quiet during this next few minutes, because I'm pretty sure he's going to be able to say things that I won't be able to say. But I just want to talk about bridges for a moment. And because we have a lot of Californians here, I thought it might be a good thing to start talking about bridges, maybe like up in the Bay Area. So let's talk about why we have bridges, first of all. You have bridges when you see that there's an unrealized potential that is happening because you have communities that are disconnected. You have one community over there, and they really can't get over here very conveniently because, frankly, there's some obstacle in the way. It's an obstacle that's immovable. And in the case that we're going to be talking about today, it just happens to be a bay. But it could be other things. It could be a mountain range. It could be a river. It could be a valley. That's what bridges are used for. They bridge over something that appears to be an immovable obstacle. And what it does is it changes life whenever that bridge is put in place. It facilitates a larger interdependent community that is much more robust and is more relevant. So this is really why we build bridges. It's not just to get from one place to another, but it's to foster communication and to make life better for both sides. It was Isaac Newton who said this, and actually it's been used more recently for other purposes in the political world around us. We build too many walls and not enough bridges. And that's a tendency we have as human beings, is to wall ourselves off from things that we consider to be perhaps threatening to us or uncomfortable. And what he says is we don't build enough bridges. Well, let me start off by talking about this particular area in Northern California. So San Francisco is surrounded by immovable obstacles. It's called the San Francisco Bay. And around that, you have San Jose, you have Oakland, you have Marin County, and just north of Marin County, you have Sonoma County. Now, these places today are really important for us. They're some of the best cities like Sausalito, but also as you get up north into Sonoma, it's known for the wine country, right? But the problem is that Marin County and Sonoma County were really not very accessible to people in San Francisco. There was this little area here which was between those two land masses, which needed to have a bridge. And that bridge would allow for people in San Francisco to go north and people in Marin County and Sonoma County to be able to go south. As a matter of fact, that bridge was estimated would save 40 to 50 miles one way for a person who needed to get into San Francisco for work, or for a person who's in San Francisco to get into those areas. So it was a real big need to have a bridge there. And what was it bridging to? Well, you had Marin County, which had lots of potential, but it didn't have that ease of transportation to be able to get there. The way that you got there was by these ferries. And there were a number of these ferries, as you can see here. One that went from Sausalito, which would get you to Marin County, but a number of other ferries that went across. And people would literally line up to go to those ferries to be able to get on the ferry and to go to cross to work or to other kinds of pursuits within the city or back across to Oakland and other places. The problem is San Francisco is so foggy so much of the time. And one of the big problems is they had a lot of wreckage where, frankly, one ship didn't see the other one, and there would be a disaster where they would have a ferry ship that would be sunk by another. And this went on for quite a while, and there was a recognition that there needed to be some change. The ferry system, first of all, was overloaded, and it was dangerous, but they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a bridge here? At least some people did. In fact, that first person in the 1800s identified that there was a need for a bridge, but nobody did anything about it for a long time. But this is what people said when they talked about a bridge. Now, this is in the early to mid 1920s when things were going really well in our economy. And they said, well, first of all, it's going to be too expensive. It's going to be too expensive. Or a lot of people said it's going to be risky. To build a bridge like that over that area would be really risky. Too disruptive. We got a lot of other things on our plate. We got to be taking care of ourselves and our own communities, and now you're asking us to throw a ton of resources into this particular bridge. Questionable safety. And here's another one. The districts that were there said, we're not sure if we build this bridge what it's going to do to our district, to our community. How will it change us? Will it change us for the better or the worse? Now, these were the things that were the objections to building this bridge. And this fine-looking gentleman, O'Shaughnessy, was the San Francisco civil engineer, and he started off by making the San Francisco watershed area, and he said, this is an area we're gonna call it a district, so we can do what we want with it, basically. And what he would do is he would reach out to a particular person I'll get to in a moment. But by the time he gets to this, it's during the Great Depression. The Great Depression is happening at a time when you would say, we just need to feed people. We need to be able to have some kind of work for people. It was at that time that they said, well, build this bridge. And he reaches out to Joseph Strauss, who had built several bridges, and he says, Mr. Strauss, would you come to San Francisco and would you consider building this bridge? And so he got together with a number of engineers, and they said, let's build this bridge, and let's make it a bridge that everybody will remember. And it becomes actually the largest suspension bridge in the world. And what he does is he gets together, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of political machinery that goes on, not only deciding how the bridge is going to be done, but also how it's going to be funded. That's really important. And so he goes through a lot of objections and difficulties. He had been brought in to build the bridge, and he finds most of the time he's spending is in political meetings trying to decide whether or not they actually want to build it. And so finally, in 1930, right at the peak of the Depression, he lays before them, he says, the Golden Gate Bridge, which he said is the bridge that could not and should not be built. That's an interesting comment. Which the War Department would not permit, which the rocky foundation of the pier base would not support, which would have no traffic to justify it, which would ruin the beauty of the Golden Gate, which could not be completed within my cost estimate of 27 million, stands before you in all its majestic splendor in complete refutation of every attack made upon it. There's two things there. First of all, we don't talk as flowery as they do. But the second thing is what he's saying, look, I've heard all your objections. I realize you don't think it can be done. But let me tell you, this is how we could do it. And so, the bill passes. And Ansel Adams, who we probably know for a lot of his photography in places like Yosemite, he documents the building of the bridge. And that bridge is put together in a matter of just 4.3 years during the height of the Depression, and it opens on May 28th, 1937. And if you paid a quarter, you could walk across that bridge. And people, yeah, a quarter. But in the Depression, I'm guessing that might have been kind of important. And so what happened is that it began to open up, as the vision was, both Marin County and Sonoma County. It changed these areas forever. And still to this day, if you go on the Golden Gate Bridge, it's not uncommon to see traffic like this, and it opens up to beautiful places like Sausalito and up into the wine country. And of course, there's other bridges that were built. There was the Oakland Bay Bridge, there was the San Leandro Bridge. These bridges all are ones that take people who otherwise would find it really almost impossible, or certainly inconvenient, to be able to have ongoing communication and commerce in the city, to be able to go back and forth. Well, of course, that's about secular bridges, right? And when we look at bridge building, there's a few things we have to kind of conclude from this. The very first thing is, you'll never get a bridge built if you don't have a compelling personal vision for why you need that bridge and why it's urgent to build it. Also, we need to fully understand that all bridge building, just like change itself, is going to come with resistance. It's going to come with objections. And that the requirement is for us to keep really focused on what's the overall good for doing this work. That's the touchstone. You do it not because it's easy. You don't do it because it is something that everybody's going to agree with you on. You do it because you know it's the right thing for overall community. And it was for San Francisco. It changed San Francisco. It changed Oakland. It changed certainly Marin and Sonoma counties. But you know, bridges that are only partially complete, they don't really serve much of a purpose. You've got to be able to finish that bridge. And so when we look at the objections, too costly, too risky, too disruptive, you know, these kinds of objections that might have happened for those for those who were considering building that bridge. I wonder sometimes if these aren't some of the same reasons that we use why we don't have bridges that we build where we have gaps ourselves. You know, there's a part of it, this is community-wide, right? But there's other parts of it that are with the person that we're having a difficult time communicating with the ecclesia next door, perhaps. So this idea about having a personal vision of the real value of building bridges. So when we turn to scriptures, we see so many examples of bridge builders. We see people like King David, that after he had taken over the throne, he'd come from Hebron and he's now in Jerusalem. He's got the United Kingdom. What did he want to do? Well, he went out of his way to go back to the house of Saul and to find a way to include people like Abner, certainly people like Mephibosheth and others, to show mercy and love to that family. And so David was a bridge builder. One of my favorite bridge builders is Hezekiah. Hezekiah, as part of the reformation of the nation that he was doing, not only was he was a king for Judea, the king of the southern kingdom, but what he did, which was so remarkable, he says, we're going to keep the Passover. We haven't kept Passover in a long time. We're going to keep the Passover. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to invite everybody in the north, every tribe, ones that don't really even talk to us very much. And he knew most of them wouldn't come. But there were some that were kind of way up to the north and on the coastal area. And so Hezekiah was an example of a bridge builder. And we see so many people like this in Scripture who find a way to bring people together in light of the fact that there were lots of obstacles. Well, I'd like to suggest that the Apostle Peter, in my mind, the way I read the gospel records, was not the likely person to be the bridge builder of the first century. But I'm going to suggest to you that's exactly what he was. It's the Apostle Peter who works with people that have very different ideas. He works with somebody like the Apostle Paul, who's got an agenda that is very different than those in Judea. And he works with the party of the circumcision and the Judaizers who want to take everybody up on the Gentile lands and make them into Jews. And he finds a way to call them all brethren, to be the one who works with all parties and eventually finds a way to build a bridge. So I think that's what we're going to see in Peter. He's the person that the Lord knew could do this job. So when you think of Simon Peter, how do you think of him? I've always kind of been drawn to him in a lot of ways because he's a man of action, isn't he? But he comes from this little town of Capernaum here. And you know what? That little domed area that you see there, that's right here, actually doesn't show, does it? Well, anyway, that little domed area that you see there is theoretically the house of Peter, and you can look down and see where that was, which I thought was interesting because it's not more than a stone's throw from the synagogue, where, as you know, Jesus preached from. So in this little town, this is where this man starts. It couldn't be a more humble beginning. He's a fisherman. We know he's married. We know that he is from a town where, yes, there is traffic that comes along the King's Highway that goes down into Egypt and up into Assyria, but overall, he's a man who is of humble beginnings. But where would he spend his life? Well, there is a period of time in his life where he would be vaulted into the biggest cities in the world. He would end in Rome, but he would go to other cities besides that. And so Peter would be a person that would have his life dramatically changed. But when you think of Peter, so this is here some words. If you were to identify a word or two here that you would say would identify what Peter's like, what would you say? What would be a first word? Impulsive. That's my first one right there. Very good. What else? Passionate. Absolutely. What else? Stubborn. Yes. Loyal. Oh, you did such great jobs. Look at this. Well, and I think we could go on, right? These are things that we see about Peter. He's this, but he's also this. That's Peter, right? He's loyal, but whenever Jesus wants him to be loyal to him in a way that Peter doesn't want, he really struggles to do that. But he is the person, he's the one that gets out of the boat and walks on water. He's the one that takes these chances. He's the one when Jesus says, "But who do you say I am?" He says, "You're the Christ." He's the first one to make that, of the disciples, to make that comment. So with all of this, a person who's impulsive, self-confident, he's got boldness of faith, he's loyal. This is when Jesus looks at this man and says, this is a person that I can use. And if you look over in your Bibles at Acts chapter 1, let's just take a quick look at Acts chapter 1 here. And look at the direction that is given to Peter and the apostles. It's just fascinating. Of course, they're thinking that the kingdom's going to be at that time. Here you have Jesus standing on the Mount of Olives. And as he's standing on the Mount of Olives, undoubtedly they must have been thinking about Zechariah's prophecy. And in verse 6, it says, will you restore again at this time the kingdom to Israel? And in verse 7, he said unto them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father hath put in his own power, but ye shall receive power after that the Holy Spirit is come upon you, and ye shall be witnesses unto me, both in Jerusalem, that makes sense, that's where they were, and in all Judea, and in Samaria, and into the uttermost parts of the earth. And when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, he was taken up. So I've just got to think, if I was there, if I were Peter also, after I just heard that this is what we're going to do, the uttermost parts, I would have had a few questions. Because if you think about what was going on, they were going to be going from where they knew life pretty well, their own hometown, their own culture, to a nearby culture with the Samaritans, and eventually to a place where they didn't have any Bible knowledge. So when you see, as an example, the Apostle Paul in Acts 17, when he's preaching in Athens, he doesn't use Bible verses. He uses their own philosophy to talk about the unknown God and to preach to them about Jesus. And so this is what was ahead. So I would say, if I were there, I would say, wait a second, before you leave, we have a few questions we'd like you to answer. Like, for instance, when are these things going to actually happen? We're here in Jerusalem, but when are these things going to happen? And how will we know when to go to these places? And what are going to be the triggers? Are you going to say it's time to go to Samaria? And how are you going to help us do that? You're going away into heaven. How are you going to be the one to help us? And who's going to do what? You want to assign different roles to us here? Will all the converts, here's a question that didn't get answered, will all the converts that need to be made, are they going to be just Jews? Or if you say go to other lands, does that mean Gentiles? And if they're Gentiles, are they going to have to follow the law? And how will we preach to different language groups? That's going to be tough, and other cultures. And finally, how are we going to make decisions? Is there a process that you want us to use for that? See, all these questions weren't answered, but they were answered. And they were answered by the way that the Lord worked in their lives to bring them to go to these different lands. In fact, it's said, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons. Just looking at a few other translations here. The periods of time or appointed times, that's not for you to know. The times of the dates, or as the New Living Translation says, the Father alone has authority to set those dates and times. They're not for you to know. And finally, Rotherham says, it's not yours to get to know the times or seasons which the Father hath put under in his own authority. So what was happening is you had this great thing that was going to happen and very, very little instruction about how and who was going to do it and what was going to happen. And that's the way God works. Our God, we're told, has very intricate plans, and great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. And the depth and the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, his ways past finding out. So when we think about our God, and when we think of what the angels are doing from the standpoint of what we might call a project, it's amazing to think about the complexity. I used to work, when I was working in the medical industry, I worked with people who were project planners. And they would lay out a project plan for years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years sometimes, depending on the product. And they were very complex, and it made it, you had to follow on with every single step because that step affected this step. And the plans of our God are incredibly intricate and difficult. But what we're told in John chapter 3 is that just as we're not able to hear, not able to know where the wind comes from or where it's going, that's the way the Spirit works in our life. It moves us, not under our control. You can hear the sound of it, but you don't know when it's going to come and you don't know where it's going. And certainly that was a way for them to understand how it was that God was going to work in their life and bring about that Great Commission. You had people like Stephen. Now, when I look at this from my standpoint, from a fleshly standpoint, can you imagine how useful Stephen would have been in the first century? Right? This was a man who was filled with the Holy Spirit, one of the 7 that was appointed in Acts chapter 6. And we hear just one of his speeches, we recognize how he was so filled with the Spirit. And yet, right away, he's taken off the scene. Now, we look at that and we say, I can't make sense of that plan. But what we do know is that is what leads to the scattering of disciples, people like Philip and others who go into other lands that wouldn't probably have otherwise gone there. So you weren't told when, you weren't told who, you weren't really understanding how the wind was going to blow, but the Lord was in control of these circumstances. And we read the very first story of that about this wonderful man, Philip, who he goes up to Samaria. He's fleeing for his life. And as he goes up to Samaria, he gets there and he begins to preach to the Samaritans, who Jesus had made a contact with before, hadn't he? And he gets there and they're ready for baptism. And Peter and John come up to see this wonderful thing that happens there. He's taken, just when he thinks perhaps that he's going to be spending the rest of his life working in Samaria to bring about more and more baptisms, he's told to go unto the Gaza, go into the area that goes down to Gaza, and there he meets up with the Ethiopian eunuch. And he meets up with the Ethiopian eunuch, and he's put just at the right time, exactly at the right place. Whenever that Ethiopian eunuch is reading from that scroll, it's exactly the right place for him to be able to talk about Jesus. And so he meets up with the chariot, preaches Jesus, baptizes the eunuch, and he must have thought, well, I'm going to head on down to Ethiopia. That's where my missions are going to be. But it doesn't work that way, does it? He's then, it says, snatched away, and he goes to Azotus, and he works his way up the coast, and I think there's good evidence to show that as he goes up the coast, what he's doing is he's starting one ecclesia after another. Finally, we find him up in Caesarea. And when he's in Caesarea, we find him with 4 virgin daughters. Now, this is quite interesting, isn't it? A person who was flexible, who said, yes, I'll go to the Samaritans, yes, I'll go down to Gaza, and I'll go up the coast, he ends up in a place where all of his personal wishes are going to be taken care of. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. And this is the way that the Lord worked in the first century. He created circumstances to allow them to be able to serve him. Their role is just to respond. Whatever's put in front of you, do that. Just do that. And this is why Peter, I think, was such a great fit for the first century. So what was it that the Lord saw in Simon Peter? What was it that he saw? Well, there were a lot of clues if we look back in the life of Peter. He was always seemingly the spokesperson for the 12. Declare to us this parable. They were all they were all unclear about what Jesus was saying, but it was Peter who said, please tell us all what you mean by this. And he was always speaking in terms of things. Even at the Last Supper, Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him that he should ask who it should be of whom he spake. So there's another disciple, possibly John, who he says, ask him who he's talking about. And you see that he's got this wonderful view about making sure that this group gets the information they need to be able to serve. And so this is why we see this passage right after he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's at that time that Jesus says to him that whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. He was this rock, and upon this rock he was going to build the church. So, what do we know more about Peter? Well, there's a whole bunch of information that we're given about what Peter was to do after he was converted. And it's interesting to look at this. He says the role that he was going to be given was to strengthen his brethren. Now that's a little different than being a church planter, isn't it? We'll talk about that in a moment. He's not a church planter, but he's a person that would strengthen other people. And so whenever we look at how did Jesus get this through to him, when we think about the very first time, it's in Luke chapter 5, and Peter, the experienced fisherman, who's early on in the development of his relationship with Jesus, he's fished all night and caught nothing. They're disappointed, and Jesus says, "Launch out into the deep for a haul of fishes." And you can read this yourself with Peter. He says, "Lord, we fished all night, but because you say it, I know that you've never been a fisherman, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to go out." And according to some of the versions, it says instead of launching the nets, he launched the net, one net. So they go out, and of course what ends up happening is the net breaks. There's so many fish, and they lose a lot of fish. And there's this wonderful comment that's made by Melva Purkis in A Life of Jesus, which is a book that really we should make sure our kids get a chance to read. It's a wonderful book. And he says this about Peter. He says, Peter was willing to acknowledge the leadership of his new master in spiritual paths. You're my rabbi. But surely Jesus had nothing to teach him in his daily tasks. Ah, Peter, how wrong you are. How wrong is every disciple who fails to acknowledge Jesus as the master in every walk of life and in every place of experience. Unless our surrender is complete, we shall toil all night and catch nothing. This is a lesson I wish I would have learned earlier in my work career. I used to think that there was sort of like a different life that happened whenever 8 o'clock on Monday morning came along. I was kind of on my own, rowing the boat myself. But then afterwards, it was time for the Lord. Again, I failed the same way Peter did, and that is to recognize that the Lord is actually inviting us to allow him to be part of all parts of our life, that he can be at my workplace, that the workplace can be a workshop for my character. It's interesting, isn't it, that when we get to John 21, and they're out fishing again, and he says, fellows, he says, cast the net on the right side of the boat. And what ends up happening is that all the penny drops for Peter. He recognizes what's going on here. and that is that this is the Lord who is commanding him. And this time, he dives into the water because he doesn't want to lose any fish. And we're told that there are 153 fish that they catch, that they bring into this big haul. And Peter is bringing it in down in the drink himself. Now, why is it that it's 153 fish? Well, every year at the Idlewild Bible School, where's Lynn? Where's Lynn? There's Lynn. Every year at the Bible School, John McDougall and I used to get together and we say, okay, this year, did you get any closer to why it was 153 fish? And we had found all kinds of some crazy ones, actually, things that only would be understood if you were a mathematical genius or kind of thing. My wife said, well, maybe it's just because it was only 153 fishes. And I thought, well, that's my wife for you. And it's pretty practical. But the fact is, when we get a number given to us like that, it's probably important. So ask yourself, who is the first person to be sent to the Gentiles? Who is the first person who really seems to be the one that the Lord uses for the Gentiles? It's Peter. It was the vision that he had of the animals that were unclean that came down on that sheet. That came down 3 times. That's the code for Peter, right? And he was told that he should rise and eat. He says, well, Lord, I never would do that. They're unclean animals. And what I've cleansed, call not thou common. And so what ends up happening is that it leads to the household of Cornelius coming into the truth. So let's go back to that 153 fishes. Why 153? Well, I'm going to make John's not here for me to tell this to, but if I've come to a conclusion, I may be wrong. It's very interesting to think about where we see the number 153. Now, I'm going to grant you, I'm going 1 for 1,000 here, so that may kind of mislead you a little bit. But if you go back to the building of the temple at the time of Solomon, what happened is that he numbered all the strangers that were in the land of Israel after the numbering wherewith his father David had numbered them, and there were found to be 150,000 and 3,600. I go, oh man, I was so close. 600 was off, except 600 were actually overseers of the work. No, that's all right. That was the bell saying it was the right answer. So, I suspect that the 153 may have meant something to Peter, that it might have connected him to how Gentiles were going to be brought in to build the temple. It's what gets used in Acts chapter 15 when it talks about the tabernacle of David, that the men were brought in to build that. So anyway, I feel like that is a potential answer, but it was Peter that this was initially done for. Now you might remember in Galatians chapter 2 that Peter was on board with Paul. Paul, I'm with you. In fact, I'm going to eat with Gentiles. I'm going to sit down and eat with Gentiles. I feel comfortable with your point of view. But then here came in these party of the circumcision from Jerusalem. And what did they want to do? Well, they said, how can you be eating with those people? And what ends up happening is that not only Peter, but also Barnabas get carried away with this. And they drop this whole idea that they had come up with and embraced with Paul, which was about the Gentiles being called in. And so what is it that happens? Paul has to rebuke, in front of others, has to rebuke Peter for this. And to Peter's credit, he accepts the rebuke. And that is actually a critical moment in the first century. Because when we go on, we find out that it was Peter who, after Paul and Barnabas had talked about all the things that Christ had done through them, it was Peter who stood up and said, Peter rose up and said, God made choice among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And it was critical that Peter, who was respected by both parties, by all these parties, would be able to do that. And by the way, that's the last time we hear of the Apostle Peter in the record of the Acts of the Apostles. We have his letters, we have other references to him. It's the last time. But what was it that got said, or that was said by James? They came up with this wonderful idea, which was that we make no other burden than these, which is to abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you do well. And that letter was carried around from ecclesia to ecclesia, explained and distributed to the ecclesias. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't exactly work perfectly. We don't have time to talk about that, but not every ecclesia followed this, and there were some revisions. The issue about food sacrificed to idols is something that Paul deals with in Corinth. But here's the thing. What it was saying is, in order to build this bridge between the Gentiles and the party of the circumcision, who appeared to be on completely different planes, well, what the Jews had to recognize is the Gentiles didn't need to become Jews. And what the Gentiles needed to recognize is they had to stop being pagans, being associated with pagan practices. There was compromise. There was a willing compromise on both sides so that they would be able to have unity together. And this is a remarkable thing, and that's why when Peter goes out and he's told to feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep, this is what he's doing. He's going out and he's talking to ecclesias throughout the Roman world at that time to be able to talk to them about the value of being one body in Christ. And when we're going to get into our last class, we're going to talk specifically about feeding the flock of God and making sure that there's oversight. So Peter would have gone from city to city, speaking about what he saw as an eyewitness to the things of the Lord Jesus Christ. He wasn't the one, like Paul, that was going to establish and plant the ecclesias in the Roman world, but he was going to be the one who would shepherd. And furthermore, the way evidence we have of this is that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we're told that Paul, making reference to Peter, says, do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? So I think it's very likely that Peter took along his wife. They went from ecclesia to ecclesia, and his role was to strengthen the brethren. Now, what were some of the things he was facing? Well, if we want to know about that, we can read what it says in the Epistle of James, probably the first written record that we have in the New Testament. And he talks about these real concerns that he was telling the believing Jews not to be like. Don't speak evil of others. Don't be people who only hear but don't do anything. Don't be dependent on riches or unconcerned with the needs of those who are vulnerable. Don't focus on a life living in pleasure. Don't be boasters. Don't allow yourself to have your lives and your ecclesias filled with envy and strife and confusion. Don't, even though you might not actually physically kill, don't do things that are like killing and fighting and warring one against another. And it's interesting that when we see these problems that happened in the first century, you wonder how many times you see similar things like this today, but that's exactly what happens to the Apostle Paul. When he goes from one ecclesia to the other, you hear about the Jews doing these things, raising up insurrection, envy and hatred, assaulting him, vowing to kill him. So this was what Paul was dealing with. It's what Peter is going to deal with as he goes from one ecclesia to the other. And this, I feel, is really the big deal. The big deal is there was huge diversity in the first century. Huge diversity. I think possibly greater than we even have today. You had the difference of Jews and Gentiles. You had within the Jewish group, you had those who were Grecian Jews and Hebraic Jews. You saw that issue in the 6th chapter of Acts, where there was a controversy about the widows and how they're being treated. There are those who are heritage ecclesias that are down in Judea, versus these new ecclesias that were being built throughout the Roman world. You had substantial cultural gaps. The way that you would teach would be different. You had Pharisees who were believers, priests who had come from the Sadducee line who were now in chapter 6 also becoming believers. You had those who were of the circumcision who said, you have to follow the law of Moses, including circumcision. You had those who were disciples of John the Baptist, those who had divisions within an ecclesia, like we're introduced to in Corinth. I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Paul. And then, of course, the other issue, which was the differences about the distribution of spirit gifts. With all this diversity, what the message was to Peter, what the message was to Paul, is somehow you need to make all of these work. You need to take these differences and find a way to unity. Brother Dennis Gillette, what he said is quite interesting. He says, so let us understand it rightly. The unity of the Spirit is not absolute uniformity, but it is the harmonization of different forces brought together, bridged together for a common purpose, and in the realization of that purpose made one. This is the unity of the Spirit. Now, there's another thing here, and that is what the Lord knew that they didn't know. What he knew was that in less than 20 years, the Jewish domination, of Christianity was going to end. 70 AD was going to come about, and there was no longer going to be apostles that were going to be kind of the leaders of the church that were going to be in the area of Jerusalem. The future of Christianity was actually going to be in the Gentile lands. And the need was to save as many Jews and Gentiles as possible. And to do so, they really had to labor to stay as one group. There would be people who would have polarizing views and be polarizing people. But the fact is, they still needed to find a way to be one. And great persecution would begin within a short number of years. And that's why repentance was so urgent. Now, of course, that calls for us to look at our own community with all the different differences, the perhaps lack of uniformity in some areas, and ask ourselves what it is that we need to do to be able to build these bridges. Well, what unity required then is, first of all, recognizing you can't make everybody happy. In fact, if it's at the expense of what we believe to be the will of God, we shouldn't even be concerned with that. That shouldn't be our objective. Unity is achieved by working through differences painfully to find a way to achieve what the Lord desires, which is one body. And so I say kudos to Paul for calling out Peter when he wanted to backtrack on that, and kudos to Peter for accepting the rebuke. Unity can only be achieved when love and humility prevail, and when we openly acknowledge it's not really us that's making this happen. It's the Lord that's in control. So what Peter was seen by Jesus was as a man who was humbled, and he could accept rebuke. And he had the courage to have his mind changed, even when it wasn't comfortable or convenient. He could be a person who was a partner to somebody like Paul. He could influence not only Paul, but he could influence the party of the circumcision. He was a bridge builder. So the question for us, each in our own individual way, in our own small molecule of the bigger organism, will we be bridge builders? Will we look for ways to build a bridge between ourselves and our brother, our sister? from one ecclesia to another and across our community. This is what the Lord requires. He wants people who build bridges to connect.